welcome back. All right, you all can have a seat. Welcome back, everybody. Did anybody begin deliberations amongst yourselves, talk with anybody outside of the jury about the case, or do any research, or hear anything about anything we talked about?
No.
All right. When we were last here, Detective Keelis had finished his testimony, and now we'll let the state call their next witness.
The state would call Dr. Vega.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Hello, sir. I'm Judge White. I'm presiding over this case. As the deputy said, just make yourself comfortable in that chair. Get about 12 to 15 inches from the microphone. It just does adjust up, down, left, and right as you need. Speak in a loud, clear voice. We should hear everything.
I will. Thank you, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your full name and spell your last name for the record?
Certainly. My name is Russell Scott Vega, last name spelled V-E-G-A.
And how are you employed?
I'm the Chief Medical Examiner for the 12th District of Florida, and that includes Sarasota County, DeSoto County, and here in Manatee County as well.
And how long have you been a medical examiner?
I finished my training in 1997, so more than 25 years.
And how long have you been the chief medical examiner?
Here, so October 1st will be 21 years.
And you said here, were you a medical examiner somewhere else before?
I was an associate medical examiner in Hillsborough County for 4+ years.
And what kind of education do you obtain to become a medical examiner?
Well, I mean, it's different from person to person a little bit. I can tell you my own personal experience.
Yes, please, yours.
Certainly. So I did my undergraduate studies at Florida State University. I majored in physics and biochemistry. After my undergraduate, I went to medical school at the University of South Florida. I graduated from medical school in 1990. Following that, I did 2 years of training in general surgery and then 4 years of training in anatomic and clinical pathology. Pathology, it's a specialty of medicine that focuses on how to diagnose diseases based on looking at cells, fluids, tissues, biopsies, organs, and by doing autopsies. Finally, after all that, I did a 1-year fellowship in forensic pathology. That's the subspecialty which really focuses on performing autopsies and doing death investigations.
Thank you, sir. And what are your current duties as a chief medical examiner, or at least, yes, as a chief medical examiner?
So as the chief medical examiner, I administer the office here. So I manage the staff, I set policy, do procedures, and I do some of the casework myself. So I do some of the autopsies and death investigations.
So you do still conduct autopsies regularly?
I do.
And do you know how many approximately autopsies you've conducted in your lengthy career?
I don't know exactly. I suspect it is getting close to 4,000.
And of those, can you have any involved gunshot wounds?
Very many of them.
And so that was my next question. The percentage, do you think it's a lot?
Yeah, I can't tell you the percentage, but I've examined many hundreds of gunshot wounds.
Thank you, sir. And actually, I'm going to draw your attention back to September of 2020. Did you conduct an autopsy on Douglas Benefield?
I did.
And when did you do that?
The autopsy was performed in the morning of September 28th of 2020.
And can you explain how your procedure for conducting an autopsy?
Certainly, and I don't think my procedure is greatly different from other medical examiners or forensic pathologists. But the procedure starts with the examination of the body in its state as it arrives, at our facility where the autopsy is performed. That includes documenting the condition of the body with photographs and diagrams and written notes. Following that, if there's reason for evidence collection, and typically that's going to be in concert with a law enforcement agency. Then evidence collection ensues. After the initial part of the examination and the evidence collection, then there is a more detailed examination looking for identifying characteristics, changes that might represent natural disease, and then any injuries that are present. After all of that, then I think what many people might consider the traditional part of the autopsy begins, which is the internal examination, where the body is examined internally for, again, the same kind of changes of injuries and natural diseases.
And is that the process you followed in the autopsy of Mr. Benefield?
It is.
Thank you. And during your autopsy, are photos taken to document injuries found, if any, on the body?
Yes.
And in this case, of the autopsy of Mr. Benefield, were pictures taken?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes.
Dr. Vega, I'm showing you what's been pre-marked as states 86 through.
Can I see the photographs, please?
Yes, they're the same as the ones you just approved. When you just look at them.
So there's 3 photographs, Your Honor, that I have an objection to.
Okay.
Well, she's going to put them back in order for me while we do that. During your autopsy, did you determine the height and weight of Mr. Benefield?
I determined the height and the body length, as that's what we measure with the body reclined on the table. I think it's a very close approximation to height. It might not be exactly the same.
Yes, sir. And what was Mr. Benefield's weight at the time of his homicide?
It was 169 pounds.
And the length?
The body length was measured to be 69 inches, or 5 foot 9 inches.
Thank you for converting it for me. And during your external exam, as we discussed, those injuries are documented in these photos as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to now show you. Sorry, Judge, just bear with me. Dr. Vega, we're going to try this one more time. I'm going to show you 86 through 97. Would you mind taking a look at those photos and telling me if you recognize them?
Yes, I do recognize them.
And what are they?
These are photos taken at the time of the autopsy of Mr. Benefield back in September of 2020.
And do they fairly and accurately depict some of the injuries and some evidence that was as they were in September of 2020?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you. Your Honor, at this time I'd ask to enter states 86 through 97.
No objection.
Received.
Thank you. And generally, when you examine Mr. Benefield's body, I'm going to display them up here in just a moment.
Okay.
And there's did you find injuries on the outside of his body?
I did, yes.
And where were they? And we'll talk about them in detail, but generally, where were they?
There was an injury to the right side of his chest, there was an injury to his right shoulder, and there was an injury to his right leg.
And did he have any injuries to his face or head?
No. Well, he did have to his head, yes, I'm sorry, not his face.
Okay. And what type of injury was that?
The injury to his head was what we would typically call in medical terminology, we'd call an abraded contusion. That's a swollen and scraped bruise. And it was on the very back of his scalp at what we'd call the occipital protuberance, or the lump at the very back of the head.
And what would that type of injury be consistent with?
Typically, it's from falling backward and striking the head.
And when you were looking at his external injuries, did you have some opinion as to what had caused them, specifically the chest and the leg?
Yes,
Okay. And what did you feel that they were?
they were gunshot wounds.
And did you then conduct an internal exam?
Yes,
And did that internal exam confirm what you felt about that they were gunshot wounds?
yes.
And I'm going to display behind you states 86. Oh, let me plug in. And I believe this is generally what we call an identification photo. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that Mr. Benefield as he was in September of 2020?
Yes.
Thank you. And then let's first talk about the injuries you said he suffered to the chest. You said that was a gunshot wound?
Yes.
And how many defects in his body were associated with the chest wound?
There was one defect, and that was on the upper right side of the chest.
And is that what we see here in states 87?
It is, although we're also seeing the injury to his right arm area as well. Actually, that's the one that has the marker on it. And the chest injury is just above and to the right of that, at least according to the viewpoint of the viewer of this photo.
And for orientation purposes, this is his right side of his body?
It is, and I'll use the laser pointer to indicate this is the arm injury, and that's the chest injury, just to the right side of his right nipple.
And was there, you said there was only one injury. Does that mean this is an entrance wound?
That's correct.
Was there any, and there was no corresponding exit?
That is also correct.
And did you locate a projectile that that was associated with this chest wound?
I did.
And where was it?
It was lodged in the tissues of the left side of the back.
I'm going to show you states 88. I believe that's a close-up of the injury we saw on his chest.
It is.
And then can you kind of orient the jury as to what we're looking at in states 89?
Yes, this is the back of Mr. Benefield's body. He has been rolled up onto his left side. So what we're seeing here is his back, the head here. So this is the left shoulder. The right shoulder would be up here. This is the left side of his back, and it's this purple area right here that represents where the projectile was lodged under the skin and the tissue.
And did you remove it?
I did.
I'm going to show you states 90. Is that the removal process for the projectile from Mr. Benefield's body?
It is. In order to visualize it and then remove it, I made an incision in the skin, which you see here. And then just for documentation purposes, I reflected the skin with the tip of the scissors so that we could photograph the projectile in place in the tissue prior to its removal.
And Dr. Vega, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to states 89. Where you described his body, but there's some skin discoloration. Can you explain to the jury why his skin looks red or darker?
Certainly. That is what we call lividity. Lividity is the settling of blood in the tissues that occurs after death when the heart's no longer pumping, and the major force acting on it is gravity. When somebody's lying on their back after death, which is typically what we see, we are of the usual process of putting somebody on their back in a dignified position after death. And so the blood typically does settle into the back, and we see this purplish coloration here, which is a result of that. There's some here as well. This area here where there isn't any discoloration, except where the bullet is because this is where the table was pressing up against the skin, and that pressure kept the blood from settling in those areas. So most of this purple discoloration is lividity, with the exception of this area right here, which is due to a little bit of bruising associated with the placement of the bullet there.
And Dr. Vega, I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked as states 14. Would you take a look at that item and tell me if you recognize it?
Yes, I do.
And how do you recognize it?
This is the projectile that I recovered from the back that you could see in the photograph you had up previously.
And other than having been repackaged for trial purposes, does it appear to be in the same or substantially the same condition as when you removed it from Mr. Benefield's back?
It does, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would ask to enter states 14.
No objection?
Received.
And Doctor, I'm going to show you states 95. Is this the same projectile that you have there in states 14?
Yes, it is.
And what, if you know, is that red part that's next to the projectile?
This is a small rubber plug that is occasionally found in certain hollow point type projectiles. Not all hollow point projectiles have these rubber plugs, but it's part of the process of creating this hollow point that allows the projectile to expand and deform, as we see in this case here.
Thank you. And so going back to the location of the projectile, based on where the entrance wound was and the where you found the projectile, did you determine a path of travel that projectile took through Mr. Benefield's body?
I did.
And what was the path of travel?
So the path of travel was one of entering the right side of the chest, striking the fifth rib on the right side, the right lung, the 10th vertebral body on the in the middle of the spine, then the left lung, the 10th rib, and then the soft tissues of the back until it stopped where it is. And that path then, if one were standing upright and straight, would be from the right side toward the left, from the front towards the back, and essentially horizontal. In other words, without angling upward or downward. And again, that's relative to a standing upright position.
Yes, sir. And would you mind, would you be so kind as to stand up and kind of point on your body to where the entrance wound would be?
Certainly.
Thank you, sir. And where would the exit wound be?
Well, no exit, but
I'm sorry, the projectile.
projectile,
Yes, sir.
my mobility is a little limited, but essentially would be in the back over here, where the tip of my thumb is.
Thank you. And would you just turn back so we can see the entrance again?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
And you said that the wound was front to back. Was it, and from how you showed, you said it was essentially horizontal.
Yes,
It wasn't front to back like it went straight through. Can you describe it?
certainly. I mean, it went through an angled path through the body, and that angle took it from the front toward the back, but at a greater angle from right to left.
Thank you. And you said that it struck his ribs and his lungs and his vertebral,
His vertebral body.
thank you.
The
So
spine.
his spine.
Yes.
And would that injury have been immediately fatal?
Probably not.
And would it have incapacitated, if you can say, incapacitated Mr. Benefield quickly?
I think it would have incapacitated him quickly. Whether or not it was immediate, I don't think one can predict.
Thank you, sir. I'm now going to take you to the arm wound. Was this wound different from the wound we saw in Mr. Benefield's chest?
Yes.
And how so? And this, for the record, states 91.
Yes, what one can maybe not clearly appreciate just from viewing the photo, but was clearly evident at the time of the examination, is that this is only a surface wound. So what you see as the mark on the skin here is the full extent of this injury. So it's an abrasion or a scrape on the skin, but outside of the effect on the skin, nothing deeper was involved with this injury.
Thank you, sir. And then you said, finally, you said he was also shot in the leg. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I'm going to show you states 92. Can you orient the jury as to what we're looking at on Mr. Benefield's body?
Yes, and this is a little bit of a tough one orientation-wise, but the injury is to the back of his leg. So what we're seeing here is the back of the leg, and it's excuse me, the calf area here. This is a perforation of that calf. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it, the calf area.
And the chest wound we saw entered and did not exit. Was this wound the same or was it different?
It was different,
And how so?
because this injury did indeed have an exit.
And where did you locate the exit?
The exit was on the right side of the knee.
And Dr. Vega, how can you, and I have a picture of that, but before we move on to that, how can you tell the difference between an entrance and an exit wound?
It's not always possible, but typically entrance wounds have more of a well-defined defect in the skin. Frequently that defect in the skin is paralleled by a defect in the tissues that one can appreciate underneath. Many times the edge of the skin perforation or the edge of the skin defect will have a ring or at least an arc of abrasion or scraping as the bullet passes through. Exit wounds tend to not have those features. One way that I like to think about this is it's like a very fast-moving awl or punch, in that it goes in and it almost drills a hole into the skin, but when it exits, what it does is it tenses up the skin until the skin tears. That's how a bullet exits. So typically, the tear doesn't have the same well-defined drilled appearance that the entrance wound rather does. And in this case, that's exactly what we see.
And I'll show you 93 that correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the exit wound associated with the entrance we just saw.
That's correct.
And I have a close-up. This is states 94. And so can you kind of show the jury how you knew this was an exit wound?
Yes. So this injury does not appear to be a round or drilled type of defect, but rather a tear in the skin that occurred when the skin was stretched until its breaking point by the bullet trying to exit.
And were you able to determine the wound path for this injury?
Yes.
And what was it?
So the wound path started at the back of the leg and went through the musculature of the calf, and then I couldn't tell for certain if the path actually went through the bones or if it passed right next to the bones, but because of blast effect injured them, causing fracture. The amount of tissue damage can make that part difficult to separate out, and that was the case here. After doing that and fracturing the very top part of the leg bones, the tibia and the fibula, it then exited through this exit defect on the lower right side of the knee.
And I hate to ask you, but would you mind stepping down and showing us on your leg where this entered and where it exited?
Certainly.
Thank you. If you're more comfortable, you can. It's easier. Yes, sir.
hard to see with the wall here, so.
Mr. Taylor, if you need to reposition so you can see, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Judge.
So on me, the entrance was down here,
If it'd help, I can put my finger there.
okay, and the exit here.
So here to here.
Yes,
And so that's, you said slightly up or up.
it's upward from the right toward the left, and and from back to front. Yes, largely all three of those components.
Thank you. Well, you know what, Dr. Vega, while you're down here, just for clarification, would you show me again the chest wound? Just because I think you're easier to see now that I've made you get off the stand.
Entrance, lodged bullet.
And would you just spin one time? Just turn so they can see. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vega. I appreciate that.
Mr. Taylor, were you able to see both of those demonstrations?
Yes, Judge White, thank you.
Dr. Vega, was there any physical evidence associated with this injury that was recovered from Mr. Benefield's body?
From the leg injury?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there was.
And I'm going to show you States 15. If you'll take a look at that and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, I do.
And how you recognize it.
This is the lead fragment which was recovered from Mr. Benefield's leg just deep to the exit defect.
And how does this differ from the projectile? Like you're saying fragment. What does that mean compared to the projectile?
Well, as we've already discussed, we have an entrance and an exit here. So essentially, the projectile exited the body. Before it did, a small piece of it broke off and remained in the tissues. This is that piece, and that's what I recovered at the autopsy.
Thank you, sir. And other than having been repackaged for trial purposes, does it appear to be in the same or substantially the same condition as when you removed it from Mr. Benefield's body?
It does.
Thank you. Your Honor, the state would ask to enter States 15.
No objection.
Received?
Thank you. And Dr. Vega, I have a photo of States, this is States 97. Is that the same item that is in States 15?
Yes.
Thank you. Did you find any, and I'm going to go back to the, well, Dr. Vega, what is stippling?
Stippling is a term we use to describe certain changes that occur in association with gunshot injuries. It refers to the pattern on the skin or any other target of unburned gunpowder fragments that strike that target and create a pattern.
And did you find any stippling associated with the gunshot wound to Mr. Benefield's leg?
I did not.
Did you find any with a wound associated with his chest?
I did not.
And what, if anything, does the absence of stippling tell you? Specifically, we'll talk about the leg first.
The absence reflects the same principle in either injury, and what it means is that typically when the weapon was discharged, it was far enough away so that the unburned gunpowder fragments, which are ejected with the bullet, had a chance to lose velocity and fall away prior to striking the skin. In general, typically that means that the muzzle of the weapon was more than 3 feet away from the target or the skin in this case. But any more precise determinations require, the test firing of a weapon or same style of weapon with the same ammunition to try and get more specific information.
And for the chest wound, if he were wearing a shirt when he was shot, would that affect what you would find on his body?
Yes.
Okay, that was why I was asking separately. And so, to be clear, you said the muzzle, so would that mean that if, it's not necessarily the body of the shooter, but if they had their arm extended, or even here, it's the end of the gun from Mr. Benefield's body?
That's right.
And I know you determined a path of travel and we're still talking about the leg injury, for this leg injury, but does it tell you, this path of travel, anything about where the shooter would have been standing?
All it really tells me is the relative position of the weapon to the leg at the time that the weapon was fired.
Yes, sir.
And trying to come up with the relative position of the shooter at the time that the weapon was discharged is much more complicated, because both the shooter and the victim, and specifically the victim's leg, can be in multiple different positions and still end up with that required relative position of the gun to the leg and still create this same injury.
And, Your Honor, may I have just one moment?
Yes.
Dr. Vega, if hypothetically Mr. Benefield were falling, would it make sense that his legs would flip up in the air enough for this path of travel? Does that make sense?
If this injury were sustained while he was falling,
Yes.
then the injury would be sustained while his body is changing its position and in motion. But regardless, at the time the weapon was fired, the muzzle of the weapon would still have to be, relatively speaking, below, to the left of, and behind the right leg in order to get this particular angle of path of travel through the leg.
Thank you. And can you tell, when you conduct an autopsy, and specifically in Mr. Benefield's, which of these wounds occurred in what order?
I cannot.
And once you completed your autopsy, did you order toxicology testing?
Yes,
And was that done in this case?
it was.
And was there any drugs or alcohol found in Mr. Benefield's body?
No, there were not.
And finally, based on everything that you did during your autopsy, did you determine the cause of death?
I did.
And what was that?
I determined the cause of death to be a gunshot wound to the chest that caused perforation of the lung, or the lungs, both lungs, with hemothoraces. It's a fancy word for bleeding that occurs in the chest.
And I didn't ask you this, but I guess, could you explain, so once this bullet entered Mr. Benefield and started to travel through his lungs, what would have been happening inside his body, or what would happen right after?
The primary things that happen there are that very rapid bleeding starts to occur. The bleeding is rapid because the lungs are very vascular, and so when they're damaged, they bleed very quickly. And also, there's no impediment to the bleeding. The cavity around the lung can expand very rapidly to accommodate bleeding. So the bleeding that happens as a result of a gunshot wound to the lung is very rapid. In addition to the bleeding, when the lung gets a hole in it, it no longer holds its shape and its anatomical arrangements, and it collapses to some extent. That collapse is made worse by the accumulating blood pressing on the lung as well. So the combination of physiological effects of bleeding and lung collapse are the primary things that are occurring in the body at the time that, or immediately following the bullet passing through the lung.
Thank you. And did you determine the manner of death in this case?
I did.
And what was that?
I determined the manner of death to be homicide.
Your Honor, may I have just one moment?
Yes.
I don't have anything else, Dr. Vega. Thank you. The defense may.
Mr. Taylor Cross, and of course the question is, do you need this?
I do not.
Yes, sir.
Afternoon, Dr. Vega.
Good afternoon.
Haven't seen you for a while. How's that new facility that you're in?
Very nice, thank you.
Just a few questions, if I may. I think you told us that the deceased was 169 pounds and stood 5 feet 9 inches tall.
Correct, yes.
Muscular build.
I don't think I used that terminology. I think I just talked about the weight and the body length.
I want to ask you, you mentioned about hollow points. You know, the public perception about hollow points is that they are more lethal. The fact is it not true that the hollow point is designed to expand when it goes through tissue?
Yes, that's right.
The theory being it's to stop a bullet from exiting and harming someone else.
That's certainly part of the philosophy or utility of having a hollow point projectile.
And when you tell us that the wound was probably not fatal, within a reasonable degree of medical science, and I think you made it pretty clear, you really can't say one way or another that upon being shot like that, he would have dropped immediately, that he may have continued for a couple of seconds.
Yes, that's right.
The stippling issue about gunpowder, it's from a distance of approximately, you told us, 3 feet.
Roughly, yes.
Okay, so when you exceed more than 3 feet, you would not expect to find stippling.
That's correct.
Okay, and you didn't find any stippling on his shirt?
I didn't examine his shirt.
Okay, so if somebody were backing away while they were firing and they got beyond that 3-foot range, there may not be any stippling.
That's correct.
All right. You said that the wound to the scalp was indicative of, you traditionally see it, of somebody falling backwards and hitting a hard surface like a tile floor.
Yes.
I want to ask you just a couple other questions. Are all homicides crimes?
Objection, Judge, beyond his expertise.
I'll allow it if the witness has the knowledge to answer.
In my experience, homicide, as determined by a medical examiner, has a certain medical legal significance, which does not necessarily imply criminality.
Okay. In simple language, it could be excusable,
Objection calls for legal.
I'll sustain.
justifiable. I think if it's within his knowledge, Your Honor.
No, I'm going to sustain because I asked for a legal conclusion as opposed to a medical conclusion.
All right. You mentioned, Dr. Vega, that you could not determine the order of the shots.
That's correct.
Okay, there is no medical method of being able to say which shot came first, which shot came second.
In certain cases, the physiological findings may help you with that, but in this case, no.
Would it be a fair statement for me to say that for the chest shot, the weapon would have had to have been pointing at his chest from the front?
Yes.
Let me just check, Your Honor. I think that might
Yes, sir.
conclude. Last question with respect to the leg. You've told us that the gun would had to have been lower than the leg to get that upward trajectory.
Yes, although I would say that, lower is a relative term.
Yeah.
And legs can be put into various different positions. And if we're going to say lower, then it needs to be clear that lower means with respect to the leg in an upright position. And if the leg were horizontal, for example, then
Yes.
we might be talking about a position which is above the leg, but pointing up towards the head of the body, for example.
Okay, so let's try to be clear here. If Mr. Benefield fell backwards and his legs went up in the air, might that injury be consistent with that?
Given that scenario, it's possible.
I believe that's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you, Dr. Vega.
State any redirect?
Yes, Judge. Dr. Vega, I don't want it to be unclear. The gun would have, for the chest wound, the gun would have had to have been in front of Mr. Benefield's body. That's what you said.
Yes,
But it didn't enter his chest. It entered, or the front of him. It entered through the side.
yes, so the weapon did have to be in front of him, but even more so, it had to be to his right side.
And based on your training and experience, is it typical that if somebody were to fall backwards, that their legs would go above their heads when falling?
Without the intervention of something to fall over, an ottoman, a chair, or something like that, it seems unlikely.
And if Mr. Benefield were running, or his legs were up in the back, could the angle have also been accomplished?
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have anything else.
That's all.
All right, can the witness be released?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir, you're released from your subpoena. You're free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.